Okay, so when we work in a Java web application, we always come across a file called web.xml. So what happens if I delete that particular file? So can we actually run a Java web application without a web.xml file? If yes, then how are we going to achieve it? If no, then why? In which scenario? All coming up right after this intro. Hey there everyone, my name is Abhilash. Welcome back to Selenium Express, and today I'm going to give you a complete walkthrough. We can or we cannot deploy our web application without a web.xml file in our Tomcat. So this is going to be a very important video, and I encourage you to watch this video till the end. Do not skip it, and before we get started with coding in the next video, go through it, understand it, have a clear vision, and then we are going to implement. Okay, so welcome to the second episode of Spring MVC Java based configuration. Here we go for the presentation. So first thing is just answer me a question here, that where we have configured the dispatcher servlet. Obviously the dispatcher servlet we have configured in the web.xml file. So the next question will be, what is a web.xml file? Okay, so few of you will say me that is a deployment descriptor. So what is a deployment descriptor? So the deployment descriptor is basically a configuration file for our web app. So all the configuration that we want to do for our web app, we can do that inside the web.xml file, and the web.xml file will be automatically picked up by the web server. The web server will be Tomcat or JBoss or something else, right? So the server will pick up this particular web.xml file automatically and going to read the configuration done by the developer. Okay, so inside the web.xml file, we define the classes, resources, and the configuration of the application. The web server uses all this information to serve a web request. When the web server receives a web request, it uses the deployment descriptor's URL mapping to send that request to a specific servlet which can handle that request. Okay, if you're getting confused with this particular line, just look at our dispatcher servlet configuration inside the web.xml file. So here is a servlet mapping. My servlet mapping here is mywebsite.com/star. So if I'll be getting a request like mywebsite.com/videos, mywebsite.com/songs, okay, so that URL mapping I have configured right here inside the web.xml. So our Tomcat is going to read this web.xml file. Whenever the Tomcat will get an incoming request starting from mywebsite.com, it is going to send that particular request to a necessary servlet which has been configured right here. For the my dispatcher servlet, we have configured this particular servlet right here is a dispatcher servlet, or we can configure any normal servlet. So Tomcat reads the web.xml file, and this web.xml file contains the information, okay, this is the incoming request and I have to give this request to this particular servlet, and that servlet is going to handle that request because we have written our Java code right there inside the servlet. Do remember one thing, our controllers are also servlet, right? I have told you during the initial videos of this particular series. Okay, so right now let's focus on the next thing. So who is reading the web.xml file? I told you the web server is going to read the web.xml file, and here it is going to fetch the information configured by the developer. Okay, then who is the web server? I told you already, in our case right now, our web server will be Tomcat. And what kind of configuration we can do in our web.xml file? That's a good question. If you are already familiar with Servlet and JSP, you might have pretty much idea about web.xml file. But just for understanding right here, these are few things we can configure inside the web.xml. For an example, I can configure my servlet and the URL mappings, and we have already seen that how we can configure a servlet when we have configured our dispatcher servlet in XML way. And apart from servlet, we can also configure filters. We can also configure security. We can authenticate the request which is coming to our website. We can authenticate, okay, this request coming to our website is eligible to proceed further or not. Is this request is authenticated? We can do that by doing login stuff and all those things. I don't want to get into that, but security also we can configure inside the web.xml file. The next thing is error handlers, right? Imagine that there is a request is coming to your server. Right now your server is failed to process that request and your server is getting an internal server error right now. So during the time you are getting the internal server error, you cannot tell the user that, hey, I'm getting an internal server error, because the user is not going to understand that. So what you can do right there, we can actually create a page like, hey, our website is down, sorry, we cannot process your request right now, please visit our website after a week, right? Those kind of handling stuff you can also configure inside the web.xml file. The next thing also, we can configure some welcome file inside our web.xml. So from all this information, we can understand right now this web.xml file seems like a very important file in our web app, isn't it? Yes, it's pretty much important. So here is the question. What will happen if I delete the web.xml file? This is right now interesting. Guys, I'll tell you one thing. We can deploy a web app without the web.xml file. If you delete the web.xml file, your web project still going to run without having any problem. So you can deploy a web app without the web.xml file. The next question is that only, right? Can we deploy or run a web app without a web.xml file? Yes, but remember, you can do it from Servlet 3.0 version. So if your web server has a servlet container which supports Servlet 3.0 specs, then of course you can deploy a web app without the web.xml file. Okay, might be confusing if you are listening to this for the first time. Let me repeat it again. If your servlet container is designed with a latest J2EE spec, with a latest servlet container, if you're using, let's say I'm using Tomcat 9. The Tomcat 9 container is obviously Servlet 3.0 plus. Okay, so if you are using a very older version of Tomcat, then obviously you will not have a servlet container which is supporting a web application without a web.xml file. So you have to be very sure that you are using Servlet 3.0 plus API, right? And the next thing, if yes, if I can deploy a web app without the web.xml file, then how I can configure important information about my web app? This is a pretty nice question. I know a lot of you might know the answer for this, and obviously we will use the Java annotation to do that. And where we can use the Java annotation, obviously inside the Java classes, right? So probably we need to create a kind of class which will be the alternative for the web.xml. Okay, we'll be talking about this, but this is the important point, as I say, that if we have a container that support the latest J2EE spec, then the web.xml file is not at all needed, right? We can do everything with Java code. Okay, so here we go. So as I said, right, if we are not using the web.xml, where we are going to configure our important information, and the information that we will configure, obviously we have to write a class in Java. So here is a question for you. If I'll write a class, hi Tomcat, please pick me, because my web.xml gets automatically picked up by Tomcat. I do not have to do anything special to tell my Tomcat that, hey Tomcat, please pick the web.xml file. Tomcat will do it automatically. So let's say right now I have a class right here. Hi Tomcat, please pick me. So will Tomcat pick this particular class automatically? Not at all. So how can we tell Tomcat? How can a class will automatically detected by Tomcat or your servlet container just like web.xml? Okay, so to do that, we have to give a superpower to this particular class called Hi Tomcat, please pick me. So without giving this class a superpower, if I am going to sit here and going to cry for the next 24 hours that hey Tomcat, please pick my class, then Tomcat is never going to listen me, right? So to make Tomcat pick this class automatically, we need to give it a superpower, that is by implementing an interface called Web Application Initializer. So this interface, Web Application Initializer, given by Spring MVC. And Spring MVC says that okay, if your class implements the Web Application Initializer and if you have a latest J2EE container which is built above Servlet 3.0 version, then obviously Tomcat is going to pick up this particular class automatically. So you do not need to remember the interface name, just understand it, right? Just listen to me. That's what I want. Okay, so right now you might be thinking, okay, this web application initializer, is it a markup interface? Not at all. This web application initializer has a method. It has only one method and the method name is on startup. The name says everything, right? The Tomcat is going to pick up this particular class and it is going to execute the on startup method automatically. You don't need to call this method. Tomcat is going to call this particular method, right? So it's a kind of callback method. The developer doesn't need to call this. The framework will call this particular method automatically, right? So as you can see, this on startup method takes an argument of servlet context, right? So inside this particular method on startup, what we can do, we can create our dispatcher servlet right here. So Tomcat is going to pick this class. Obviously it has a method. Inside this method, what we will do, we'll create our dispatcher servlet object, right? So automatically our dispatcher servlet object will be created. And once the object is getting created, we need to make sure we need to register our dispatcher servlet with the servlet context object. So here is the big one. What is the servlet context? So we'll get the servlet context argument right here. So with this servlet context, we need to register, we need to add the servlet that we have created right here. We'll create the dispatcher servlet and we'll add that dispatcher servlet with the servlet context. Right now, it's a confusing word. What is a servlet context? And obviously, I know if you have completed your JSP and servlet course, you already know about servlet context, but here are few important information about the servlet context. The first thing, the servlet context is an interface. It's not a class, it's an interface. So if it is an interface, the next question which is going to come to me is, okay, Abhilash, if it is an interface, then where is the implementation? Okay, so as a developer, we do not give the implementation of servlet context interface. Then who actually give it? So your web server is responsible to give the implementation for the servlet context interface. So servlet context interface given by Java people is given by Oracle. Now the implementation for the servlet context interface is given by your web server vendor. Let's say I'm using a Tomcat here. So my Tomcat is responsible for implementing the servlet context interface, right? So Tomcat should have a class, it should implement the servlet context interface, and it should override all the methods which are there inside the servlet context interface. I don't care about it. Tomcat is going to give the implementation for this. Okay, so the next question. Hey Avilash, do I need to create the servlet context object? No. The servlet container Tomcat is going to create the object for servlet context. So whenever we are going to deploy our web application inside Tomcat, Tomcat is going to automatically create the servlet context object. We are going to add all our information with the servlet context reference, and later Tomcat is going to create the object for the servlet context and going to read all the information which is set there with the servlet context object. So it's pretty much important. Okay, just listen to me. Don't worry about if you're not getting something, right? Just listen to me. Okay, so the next thing that you have to remember that the servlet context object created one per web application, right? There will be only one object created for servlet context, and every information that we want to set for our web application, we can set it right there. Okay, so here is another point. If any information is shared with all our servlets, as I said, controller are also servlet. So if any information is shared with all our servlets, then we can attach it with the servlet context object. If we think this is the important information I want to share with all the servlet, with all the controllers, then we can set it with the servlet context object, right? So here is the thing that we have learned so far. Web application initializer, there is an interface, and this interface is provided by the Spring MVC that ensures your code based configuration, and that will be automatically detected and initialized by any servlet 3 container. And as I said, the web application initializer, this particular interface has one method called onStartup, and that onStartup method takes a servlet context reference as an argument, and here actually we can create a dispatcher servlet and can register or can set our dispatcher servlet with servlet context reference, so that whenever Tomcat is going to create the object for this servlet context equal to new, then the class provided by the Tomcat, right, it is going to use the new keyword to create the object for this, and at that time Tomcat can fetch all the information that we are setting with this particular reference right here, because the object will be created by Tomcat. At that time it is going to read out all the information. Okay, so that's pretty funny, right? It feels like a chocolate right now. We're going to create a class, we're going to implement the web application initializer, and we'll make sure that our Tomcat is latest, just like Tomcat 9 or Tomcat 8, right? So before we wrap up this particular presentation, one last thing. Make sure you understand this point. I am continuously repeating this particular point, and this time I want to show you a picture. The dispatcher servlet has its own web application context. So in this picture I got it from the Spring official documentation. You can see the dispatcher servlet. It has a web application context where we can put our controllers, handler mapping, view resolver, and a lot of things. And this thing, kindly ignore it for right now because this video is getting longer, right? I don't want to give you all the information in one shot, right? We can speak sometime later, but for now, this dispatcher servlet has a web application context. To initialize a dispatcher servlet, we need a web application context. Just remember this much. Okay, with this much of knowledge, let's go for coding, and my job stops here because this is the most difficult thing for me to do, right? To make you understand something. And right now, we're going to code, my favorite part, right? Coding is easy, right? Only we have to understand what we need to code, right? If that vision is clear, then doing coding is a 5-minute job. So let's get started and let's understand it step by step. Okay, so that's it for this video. First of all, I'm really sorry because the recording did happen well. So my mic actually stopped working, so probably you had a bad audio experience. No worries with that. Okay, so the next thing is, in the next video, we're going to get started with coding. Okay, we're going to implement our dispatcher servlet without using a web.xml file. We are going to use the web application initializer interface, and we're going to see it in action. So I really encourage you to watch the next video right now, and I'm damn sure it is going to be really easy. But before that, make sure that you already know what is a dispatcher servlet, because I'm not going to repeat it.
If you do not know what is a dispatcher servlet, first of all, you watch my dispatcher servlet video, which is available in my Spring MVC for beginner playlist. Okay, so see you in the video, and we'll get started with the coding in the next video. Take care.